The episode begins with Dr. John Watson, a former army doctor who has returned from service in Afghanistan with physical and emotional scars. He is struggling to adjust to civilian life and has recurring nightmares about his time in the war. In an effort to cope with his stress symptoms and trust issues, his therapist suggests he start a personal blog to write about his experience. However, John replies that nothing exciting ever happens to him. Later in the episode, we see 3 flashbacks of events from the previous year. The first is of a successful businessman, Sir Geoffrey Patterson, who is lost at a railway station and is forced to take a cab, which he is not used to doing. He is later seen in his office having a seizure and dying after taking a capsule from a glass jar. The second flashback is of a young man named James Phillimore who, after failing to hail a cab, goes missing and is later found dead in a gym, also after taking a capsule from a jar. The third flashback is of a local MP named Beth Davenport who is celebrating her nomination to the Ministry of Transport at a wild party. However, she disappears from the party and is later found crying in a fenced yard with a glass jar containing capsules by her side. Following this, the police held a press conference about the death of the MP. Sergeant Donovan says that the MP's death is similar to the other 2 deaths, and they are all being treated as connected. Detective Lestrade says that the 3 victims all took the same poison, but other than that, there is no connection between them yet. However, Lestrade is confident they will find one. Suddenly, everyone's phone receives a text that says wrong, except Lestrade gets another text that says you know where to find me. SH. After the conference, Donovan complains to Lestrade about the text sender, but Lestrade says that he does not know how the sender does it and can't stop it. Scene shifts to John. He is walking in the park when he meets a man named Mike Stamford. They know each other from their time as interns at a hospital. While talking, John tells Mike that he might have to leave London because he can't afford an apartment and doesn't think anyone would want to share with him. Mike tells John that someone else told him the same thing today and takes John to meet that person at the morgue. At the morgue, they meet Sherlock Holmes. He is in the middle of an experiment and ignores the efforts of a woman named Molly Hooper to talk to him. In the lab, Sherlock and John meet for the first time. Sherlock asks Mike for his phone and John offers his. Sherlock asks John if he has been in Afghanistan or Iraq, then asks if he would mind having a flatmate who plays the violin when he thinks and doesn't talk for days. Sherlock knows that John is an army doctor who has a problematic brother and that his limp may be psychological. He gives John his name and address, 221B Baker Street, and quickly leaves. At the same time, a woman with a pink outfit picks up a jar containing the suicide pills with a shaky hand. The next day, John and Sherlock then go to see a new apartment. The apartment is owned by Mrs. Hudson, who is offering Sherlock a special price because he helped put her husband in prison. After they move in, Sherlock wants John's opinion, but he is disappointed when John seems unsure about Sherlock's abilities. This leads to an argument where Sherlock shows off his skills by reading John's military background and his brother's drinking habits from just looking at his face and phone. John is curious about how he did it, but Sherlock does not answer. Mrs. Hudson interrupts them, asking why Sherlock is not working on the recent string of suicide. Sherlock quickly notices a police car outside with its lights flashing and realizes that there has been a 4th suicide. Lestrade comes in and tells them the address of the latest victim. Sherlock is unhappy when he hears that Anderson, who he does not like to work with, is in charge of forensics. He decides to go to the scene anyway and asks John to come with him. He knows that John has seen a lot of violence and death in his army career, but he still challenges John by asking if he wants to see more. John eagerly agrees. As they take a taxi to the crime scene, John notices that Sherlock is texting on his phone. Finally, Sherlock tells John to ask any questions that are on his mind. John asks where they are going and what Sherlock does exactly. Sherlock explains that they are going to a crime scene where he will assist the police as a consulting detective, which is a job he invented and is the only one in the world to do. John says that the police don't consult with amateurs, and Sherlock tells him how he deduced that John was an army doctor. He explains that he can tell from John's posture and the way he speaks, and that his injury was sustained abroad, judging from his tan. He also says that John's limp is partly psychological, which his therapist agrees with, as John seems to forget about it when he is still. Regarding John's brother, Sherlock notices that the expensive phone John has is only 6 months old and has a message inscribed on it from Clara. The phone also has scratches and damage around the charging port, which Sherlock deduces is because the original owner had a heavy drinking problem and their hands trembled when they plugged the phone into charge each night. The fact that John was given such an expensive present indicates that the relationship between Harry and Clara has failed, and that Harry is the one leaving the relationship. If it were the other way around, the phone would be kept due to sentiment. They still want to keep in touch, but John doesn't go to him for help, meaning John must disapprove in some way. Upon reaching the crime scene, Sherlock asks John if he made any mistakes in his earlier observations. John corrects one error, that Harry is actually short for Harriet, making John's sibling a sister. When they are stopped at the crime scene taped by Sergeant Donovan, she calls Sherlock a freak and he retorts by pointing out that she did not go home the previous night. Sherlock and John enter the building. Once inside, they are greeted by Lestrade, who brings them to a room where the victim, Jennifer Wilson, is lying face down. Sherlock starts examining the body and finds several clues. He notices the message rake scratched by the victim's fingernails, and Anderson mentions that rake is German for revenge. Sherlock corrects Anderson by completing the word to Rachel. He also observes that the victim's coat is wet, but the pocket umbrella is dry, suggesting she was in extremely windy and rainy weather, too windy for an umbrella. He also notes that the victim's jewelry is clean except for her well-worn wedding ring. The inside of the ring is clean but the outside is not, indicating that she was unhappily married for more than 10 years and regularly removed her wedding ring for secret affairs. Sherlock figures out that the victim was from Cardiff and in town for only one night due to the weather. He then asks John to examine the body, making Lestrade acknowledge him as Sherlock's assistant. Sherlock explains that if the police want his help, they have to do it his way. John tries to help, but he can only say that the victim probably died of choking while seizing. Lestrade asks Sherlock for his conclusion, and Sherlock explains all he has found out. He asks about the case and learns that there was no suitcase. This leads Sherlock to deduce that the victim was accompanied by someone who took the suitcase, meaning she was driven there and forced to commit suicide by a serial killer. This also shows that the other 3 victims were murdered. John is left alone at the crime scene and heads towards the exit. Donovan warns him to stay away from Sherlock, calling him a psychopath who will eventually get bored and start committing crimes himself. As John walks towards a main road in search of a cab, he hears ringing phones in a phone booth, a shop, and another booth. The third time, he picks up the phone and hears a voice that tells him to check 3 security cameras in the area. The cameras all move and focus on the opposite side of the street while a black car arrives. The voice tells John to get in the car, which he does. Later, John is driven by Anthea, who doesn't reveal her real name, to a warehouse where a man is waiting. The man, who is the closest thing to an enemy that Sherlock has, questions John about his relationship with Sherlock. John tells the man that he only met Sherlock yesterday, and that it's none of his business. The man offers John money in exchange for information about Sherlock, but John refuses. He receives a text from Sherlock asking him to meet at their potential flat, and the man warns John about the dangers of being associated with Sherlock. John decides to go to his old apartment to get his gun before heading to Baker Street. When John arrives at Baker Street, Sherlock asks him to send the message what happened at Lauriston Garden. I must have blacked out. 22 Northumberland Street, please come to Jennifer Wilson's phone number. Sherlock then takes a small pink suitcase from the kitchen and he tells John that he is not the killer, despite the text message and the suitcase. He explains that the killer probably drove Jennifer to Lauriston Gardens, but made the mistake of taking the pink suitcase with him, which would easily draw attention. Sherlock searched for nearby dump sites accessible by car and found the right one in under an hour. One thing that is missing is the victim's phone. Since the victim was a serial adulterer, she would be careful with her phone, so it's possible that the killer either took it on purpose or by mistake. Sherlock realizes that the hunt is on when John's phone rings after he sent the text message. He and John go to a small Italian restaurant near 22 Northumberland Street. The restaurant owner, an old friend of Sherlock, wants to serve them a free dinner. John tries to explain that he's not with Sherlock, but they still eat the dinner. John takes the opportunity to ask Sherlock some personal question. After an uncomfortable conversation, in which they establish that John is straight and Sherlock is married to his work, Sherlock says he thinks the killer is someone who can stalk and approach victims on the streets without arousing suspicion. Suddenly, a taxi stops in front of 22 Northumberland Street and the passenger in the back looks around but doesn't get out. Sherlock quickly leaves the restaurant, with John following, and they chase after the taxi. They eventually catch up to the taxi, and find out that the passenger is just an American tourist who has just arrived from Los Angeles. Sherlock and John run back to Baker Street, and the doorbell rings. It's the restaurant owner with John's cane. Sherlock texted him to have it sent back as a housewarming gift for John, since he's sure that John will be staying with him at Baker Street. Upon arriving at the house, Sherlock and John discover that Lestrade and his team are searching the apartment under the pretense of a drug bust. Lestrade wants to make a point and find the evidence from the suitcase that he believes Sherlock will discover. Anderson wants to arrest Sherlock as a murder suspect, but Lestrade wants his help with the case. It has been discovered that the name of the murdered woman, Rachel, was actually the name of her stillborn daughter who had died 14 years prior. Sherlock is skeptical and wonders why the victim would have written her daughter's name as she was dying. He thinks she must have been trying to pass on important information. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hudson informs Sherlock that his taxi has arrived, but he didn't order one. As the search continues, the clues begin to make sense to Sherlock, and he realizes that the murdered woman was not just clever in hiding her relationships, but also in hiding the evidence of her murder. She had not lost her phone, but instead planted it on her killer. Since she didn't have a laptop, she tried to scratch Rachel on the floor as the password to her smartphone's GPS, which would lead to the killer. Mrs. Hudson again mentions the taxi driver, and Sherlock realizes that the cabbie could be the killer and has the missing phone. He goes outside to follow the cabbie without telling anyone, while John tries to call the victim's phone. The cabbie confesses to the murders, but warns Sherlock that if he calls the police, he will surrender, but never reveal the details of the deaths. The only way for Sherlock to find out is to get in the taxi and go with the cabbie. The cabbie tells Sherlock that he knew who he was when he chased his cab because he was warned about him and had read his website. When asked who warned him, the cabbie remains silent. They end up at an empty school building. Meanwhile, John, who is still by the laptop, hears it beep as it updates the GPS location of the victim's phone and rushes off to follow. The cabbie challenges Sherlock to a final showdown of intelligence. He puts 2 bottles on the table, each containing a large pill. The cabbie explains that one pill is harmless, but the other is lethal poison. If Sherlock selects the safe pill, the cabbie will eat the other pill at the same time, and they will find out who the real genius is and who will die. Sherlock checks that both bottles are identical, and the cabbie confirms. The cabbie boasts that he has already won this game 4 times, claiming it is not a matter of chance, but of genius. Sherlock deduces that the game is about the cabbie's children. The cabbie admits that he has been estranged from his children for 3 years, and that he has been told he is dying. He says that the inheritance he will leave for them is small. At that moment, focused on his children and his own mortality, the cabbie looks at the pill bottle on his left, and Sherlock deduces that it is the one with the lethal poison. Sherlock suggested to the cabbie that he could leave without taking the pill, but the cabbie pulls out a gun. But it turns out to be a lighter. The cabbie tells Sherlock to choose a pill again to prove that he is the superior genius, but Sherlock says he solved the puzzle easily. He picks the pill in front of the cabbie, and they both prepare to take them. Suddenly, a shot is fired and the cabbie is hit. Sherlock ran to the window and looked outside, but did not see the shooter. He returned to the cabbie and asked if he made the right choice, but the cabbie just smiled. Sherlock kicked the cabbie's wounded shoulder and demanded the name of the serial killer's sponsor. The cabbie screamed Moriarty and died. It revealed that the reason behind the murders was that Moriarty promised the cabbie to send money to support his children for each successful murder. Moriarty planned to attract Sherlock with these unsolved murders and thought that he wouldn't be smart enough to survive the battle of wits. Later, the police, led by Lestrade, are investigating the shooter. Sherlock tries to deduce who the shooter is and comes to the conclusion that they're a skilled marksman with a strong moral code. He then realizes that John is the shooter. He pretends to be confused and ranting nonsense because of the shock and walks away with John. John admits that he killed the driver, but explains that he wasn't a nice person. They both start laughing and John asks Sherlock if he would have taken the pill in a similar situation. Sherlock tries to deny it, but John says that he risks his life just to prove that he's clever. At this point, a tall man who had previously kidnapped John appears and Sherlock recognizes him. He wants Sherlock to work with him. The two have a short argument and it's revealed that the man is Sherlock's brother, Mycroft. Mycroft says he's just a minor government official, but Sherlock tells John that he's actually the British government. Sherlock and John then go to a dim sum restaurant to talk about a new mystery man named Moriarty. Mycroft orders Sherlock and John's surveillance upgraded to a higher level. And that's it for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the investigation as much as we did. But the adventure isn't over just yet. Keep your eyes peeled for the next episode, where we'll be unraveling yet another exciting case. Don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts and theories. Until then, goodbye.